Hello, and welcome to the Home Tenant-Based Rental Assistance Program Training and Overview. My name is Cody Sibley, and I am the program analyst who manages the Home TBRA program. I also manage the Emergency Solutions Grant, or the ESG program. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide a brief overview of the program itself, and then to go into detail about the funding application, the budget application, and the different documents that we need um, in order to in order to subgrant the funding out to you guys through the master grant agreement. This presentation will not go into certain topics such as documents that we need from you throughout the program. It also won't go into like certain eligibility requirements and verification requirements of the program itself. The reason for that is there are some changes happening at the HUD level that could make some of the information I give you obsolete or outdated. So I will be having a second meeting with everyone on April 16th to go over those changes. But for now, we're going to focus on this program as it relates to the master grant agreement. So general overview of the program. Again, this is be pretty high level. So this this language right here was taken from the purpose section of the regulations that create the program. So the Home Tenant-Based Rental Assistance Program is actually a slice of a larger home grant that OHCS receives. Most of that funding is actually housed in the affordable rental housing section, but we get a piece of it to provide tenant-based rental assistance to low and very low income individuals. So if you want, you can read over this language, but basically it gives us the ability to provide rental assistance through this grant. Budget and allocations. So we allocate funds to community action agencies using the following criteria weights. The number of individuals that are severely housing burdened, that is 20% of the allocation. Those that are just housing burdened is 30%. The poverty rate of your community is 15% of your allocation, and then the next 35% of your allocation is based on the number of people uh, or the number of households who have less than or equal to 50% of your median household income. Um, we assess these criteria on county-wide statistics. However, um, if you have regions within your service area that receive funds, home funds directly from HUD, will exclude those populations from the allocation. So, for example, Eugene receives funding directly from home, so we don't look at the population of Eugene whenever we decide how much money to give to Lane County from OHCS. That being said, just because we allocate it a certain way doesn't mean that you can't also serve people in Eugene with that funding. Same goes for Mid-Willamette. We don't look at Salem's population because they get money directly from HUD. But if someone from Salem or someone who lives in Salem qualifies for this program and you want to put them on that program, you are able to do so. So that's how we determine the allocations, but you can serve anyone within your service area that qualifies for this program. So the Home TBRA program has the following categories: admin, which is limited to 10% of your allocation, and program. So it's a very straightforward program, just two categories, and we're going to kind of go into each one in more detail throughout this presentation. Part 2, expense categories, eligible costs. So admin, as I mentioned, is limited to 10% of your allocation. It is eligible only under general management oversight and coordination of 24 CFR 92-207A. And the general oversight and coordination includes the following costs. So salary, wages, and related staffing costs, travel costs, admin services performed under third-party contracts or agreements, any other goods and services required to administer the program, and the cost of administering the TBRA program. So these are pretty broad cost and categories, but whenever you're charging admin, just make sure that it's under general management oversight and coordination for the program, and that it can fall into one of those categories. The program category, this can pay for the monthly rental assistance for an individual or family or household. Also, the prorated rental assistance. So think like first month's rent, last month's rent. It can pay for that as well. It can pay for a security deposit with the caveat that the security deposit cannot be more than twice the monthly rent. Well, it can be more, but home won't pay for more than twice the monthly rent. Utility deposits, it can pay for that. However, if you're going to provide someone with utility deposit assistance, you have to accompany it with either security deposit assistance or monthly rental assistance. It has to be one or the other. And finally, program can also pay for the cost of inspecting a housing for compliance with either HQS or Inspire. So a little bit about the monthly rental subsidy. It is generally designed to reduce a household's rental payment to 30% of the monthly adjusted income. There are some exceptions. So the subsidy cannot exceed 110% of the fair market rent or 110% of the small area fair market rent. If the rent exceeds that amount, then the tenant could be responsible for paying the difference, or you as a subgrantee can provide other funding sources to kind of make up that difference for the tenant, whatever works for y'all. The tenant is responsible for a minimum tenant contribution. In previous years, that has been $10. However, as I mentioned, we'll be having a meeting later in April to discuss whether to change the minimum tenant contribution. The prorated rent. So prorated rent is just really first month's rent, last month's rent. But an interesting thing about that is a subgrantee can pay up to the full rental subsidy for any prorated rent, regardless of the minimum tenant contribution. So if, let's say, for the first month, the tenant is only responsible for, the landlord says, okay, you only need to pay us like $500 for the first month because it's like mid-month, and the tenant's normal subsidy is $500, then you can just pay the full 500 using the subsidy without requiring the minimum tenant contribution. The next piece of eligible expense is called, well, it's the security deposit. So you can provide security deposit assistance to tenants either as a standalone program or in conjunction with rental assistance subsidies. Please keep in mind that security deposit, it differs to state and local definitions. So ORS 90.100 subsection 42 is the state definition of security deposit. I will allow you to read it on your own. Please note, however, if you have a local jurisdiction with an additional supplemental security deposit definition, you need to take that into account as well. As I've said before, the subsidy is limited to twice the rent, and the tenant keeps any refund at move out. And then lastly, we have the cost of inspecting housing, so HQS or Inspire reimbursement. Subgrantees may be reimbursed for the cost of inspecting the housing for compliance with HQS or Inspire standards. It is part of the program category, and it's limited to being reimbursable for households that are basically either on the program or attempting to be on the program, right? So if they were never planning on being on the TBA program, and let's say you were going to put them on, elderly rental assistance, we could not use home funds to pay for that inspection. But if someone is on the program, you can pay for it. If someone was going to be on the program, but let's say you lost touch with them or they got a Section 8 voucher instead, we could still reimburse you because those expenses already occurred. So, if that is the case though, like if it's special case where they're not on the program, but there was an attempt to be on the program, OHCS may require additional documentation. And if the documentation is not sufficient, then we may have to disallow the cost. It is just because, with these types of things, we need to make sure that we're able to pass a HUD audit, pass a Secretary of State audit, and we want to make sure we're accounting for the funds. So please keep that in mind. We also have the ability to limit the maximum reimbursement rate. Um, in previous years, we've limited it to $50. However, with the move to Inspire and inflation, we are reassessing that number, and we will have a discussion with the entire CA network to see what an appropriate reimbursement rate should be. So, participant eligibility. So this is something that has not changed, and we don't anticipate it changing. So right now, at least 90% of households served must have annual incomes that are 60% or less than the median family income for the area at the time of occupancy. So that basically means for every, yeah, um, you know, 9 out of 10 households that you serve need to have incomes that are 60% or less than the median family income at the time of occupancy. And then the remaining 10% can have up to 80% of the median household income for the area. So 1 out of every 10 households can have up to 80% AMI, 9 out of 10 can have up to 60% AMI. The lease should be for about 1 year. HUD prefers a year lease, but if a shorter lease is agreed upon by the subgrantee tenant and landlord, that's fine. And just to kind of go over a point of confusion, the lease and the contract and the subsidy can be renewed as long as funding is available. So this program does not have a time limit for, the length of time that for the duration that someone can be on the program. As long as they're eligible and as long as the funding is available, they can stay on the program. Um, Lastly, the tenant must be able to select the housing unit of their choice, but the subgrantee can limit the selection to units within the service area. So generally, the tenant has the ability to pick whatever housing unit they want. However, you as a subgrantee can say, we service this area. If you go over to, Yamhill County, for example, you may need to reach or access YCAP to be put on the home TBA program. That's okay to say. Um, Also, kind of going back to you know, the service areas that receive funding directly from HUD, et cetera. If you service someone who was in a rural part of the county and then they're like, I want to use a subsidy to move to an urban area, that's fine. They can do that and you can still service them using the home TBA funds. So now we're going to go into the funding application or the required documents for the master grant agreement. So there are two required documents in order to implement this program. One of them is called the Affirmative Marketing Plan. So the Affirmative Marketing Plan basically is your plan on how you plan to reach eligible households that are least likely to apply. We also need to know the methods that you'll use to inform the public, landlord, and potential tenants about federal, state, and local fair housing laws. We need a statement on where applications will be accepted, the hours during which it can be submitted, and alternative options for completing the application if time and location would be a barrier. So, for example, if you tell us that you are going to accept applications Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., we would need to know, what are you going to do whenever that is not an option for people who want to be on the program? Um, and then, yeah, so the next thing we'll need is the process that you'll use to maintain records of action taken to affirmatively market the available assistance. And then the process that you'll use to assess the effectiveness of the subgrantee's current marketing procedures. So basically, how do you plan to reach these people that are hard to reach? or these populations that are hard to reach? And then how are you going to assess whether that is an effective practice or not? The second required document is called the tenant selection policy. You'll see that there's some duplication here from the affirmative marketing plan. Um, so what I would tell you is while we need all these elements in both, if you, let's say you write the affirmative marketing plan first and then you write the tenant selection policy, um, you could in the tenant selection policy just say, you know, please see affirmative marketing plan for like, this policy, and this policy, and that would be fine. You would actually it would actually be a little bit preferred too because if you make a change to one, you'd have to make a change to the other. So it's easier to make a change in one spot and it avoids accidentally contradicting yourself if you write, policies in a way that aren't identical. So um yeah, just keep that in mind. So the tenant selection policy identifies populations that will be given preference for assistance if applicable, right? You have the ability to have a local preference. Please note, however, you just need to ensure that you are not violating the Fair Housing Act and that you're complying with all local, state, and federal non-discrimination laws and policies whenever you write your local preference. So your policy needs to include a description of populations that will be given a preference, if applicable. You also need to make sure that you state explicitly that households will be in that there will be income restrictions for people that are applying. Um, you need an explanation for the population preference, supporting documents, so data, needs assessment, or local government determination, etc. Sources cited. Please make sure that you are giving us enough supporting documents and enough data as possible. The more you give, the easier it is for us to, be able to approve it, and also the more robust your policy will be. So we always encourage more data, more information over less. The detailed list of the selection criteria that will be used to identify prior applicants. The description of how written waiting lists will be designed and used. So this program does require you to have a waiting list. Um, you can adopt your Housing Choice Vouchers waiting list, which eases some of your administrative burden. Please note if you do that, however, you kind of lose your ability to have any sort of local preference, right? Because your waiting list kind of needs to align with your local preference. So if you use your Housing Choice Vouchers, you don't really have that local preference. Um, and vice versa. If you want a local preference, you might not be able to adopt your Housing Choice Vouchers plan waiting list. So keep that in mind. We'll also need a description of approaches that subgrantees will use to reach households that are least likely to apply. That is something that is also in the affirmative marketing plan, so you can reference that plan when you're writing the tenant selection policy. You can also, if you write your tenant selection policy first, you can reference your tenant selection policy in your affirmative marketing plan. My only ask is that you pick one or the other. I wouldn't interchange them. Like I wouldn't reference the affirmative marketing plan in the tenant selection policy sometimes, and the tenant selection policy in the affirmative marketing plan sometimes. I would just kind of pick one um, to be your primary policy and then have the other one. And then you'll need a statement of where application will be accepted, the hours, and then alternative options for completing the application if the time and location is a barrier. Okay, now we're going to move on to the budget application. And this part is very simple because, like I've said before, there are basically two categories, admin and program. So admin is 10% of the allocation, program is the rest of the allocation. You still need to submit this budget application, even though it's only two categories. The reason being is, while you can have up to 10% of your award be admin, if you would rather a smaller slice of that go to admin and the rest go to program, that's fine. You just need to let us know. Um, so that's why we require it. I will also say that this grant is exempt from the spend down policy, so you will not need to put in the quarterly expenditure rates. So yeah, admin, program, submit it. And that's everything. So thank you all for watching this presentation. If you have any questions at all, please contact me. My email is cody.sibley@hcs.oregon.gov. Um, I'm happy to assist you as needed and answer any questions to make sure that this is as smooth a process as possible. Thank you so much.